Hi, I'm Jillian Koch. I'm a partner at Johnston, Morrison Hunter Chartered Professional Accountants. We have teamed with the Manhattan District Chamber of Commerce to provide some information sessions on some of the current government programs that are available to businesses that have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So today I'm going to speak on the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy Program, or CERS, as you'll hear me call it throughout this presentation. So we'll just jump straight into it. All right. So what we're going to be talking about today is the previous rent subsidy program that was in place, who can apply for this new program, what are the claim periods and deadlines, how does it get calculated, and how exactly do you end up actually applying for it? So the previous rent subsidy program was in place from April to September 2020. Under that program, the tenant would pay 25% of their monthly rent. The landlord would essentially cover 25% of the rent, and then the provincial and the federal governments would cover the remaining 50%, each providing a subsidy of 25% to the landlord. The landlord had to apply for the subsidy, and so they were responsible for collecting all the information from both their tenant and gathering the information that was necessary on their own property. It was not a particularly popular program, and so essentially this program has now been replaced by a new version of the rent subsidy program, where the application process falls to the renter or the person who's using the property. So who can apply for this program? You must meet all 4 criteria: have a CRA business number, be an eligible business, charity, or nonprofit, have experienced a drop in revenue, and have eligible expenses. So for a CRA business number, you must have had one of the following: a CRA business number on September 27th, 2020, or a payroll account on March 15th, 2020, or another person or partnership made payroll remittances on your behalf, or you purchased the business assets of another person who had a CRA business account on September 27th, 2020, and you made an election under the special asset acquisition rules. We won't speak about those special asset acquisition rules at all, but just know that if you did actually step into a business, you could still qualify for the CERS program, even if you yourself was not registered at that time. Or finally, you meet other prescribed conditions that might be introduced. So at this time, there are no other prescribed conditions, but essentially this just will allow the government to add some additional criteria under the business number to ensure that individuals can get into it if necessary. If you don't currently have a business number, but you qualify under point A or B, you will need to set up one to apply for CERS. Note that it does not need to be a payroll account number, it just needs to be a business number of some sort. So what exactly is an eligible business? So it could be an individual or a sole proprietor, a corporation that is not exempt from income tax, registered charities, partnerships consisting of eligible entities, as well as people that are exempt from income tax, such as nonprofit organizations or agricultural organizations. Please note that this is not a comprehensive or an exhaustive list, so there are still possibilities for eligibility if you do not fall into one of these categories. The one thing to note, though, is if you are an affiliated entity and you're affiliated with other entities who are applying for CERS, you must agree how to split the $300,000 limit for eligible expenses. So essentially what this means is if you have another affiliated entity and they're claiming $50,000, your limit per claim period will be $250,000. So what exactly is an affiliated entity? This would be like an individual and their spouse, 2 corporations who are each controlled by different people, but those people are related, or if you have 2 corporations where you're the sole shareholder, those corporations will be affiliated by virtue of the fact that you are the shareholder of them. So to qualify, you must have had a drop in revenue when comparing your eligible revenue during the reference period with your eligible revenue from a previous period baseline. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that reference period is and what a baseline is. But just note that there is no minimum revenue drop required. Any revenue drop is a good revenue drop. So what exactly is eligible revenue? Typically, it'll be selling goods, rendering services, or others' use of your resources. So in order to qualify, you must first be using qualifying property. And so qualifying property will be real or removable property, aka land or buildings that you are owning or renting and that you are using in the course of ordinary activities. So the following properties would not typically qualify: houses, cottages, other residences that are used by you, your family, or non-arm's length people, or properties that you're using primarily to earn rental income. So if you have a property and really the only source of revenue you're having is rental income, you are not going to be qualifying for the CERS program. Instead, your tenants are going to be qualifying, which will enable them to be able to pay you. So how much can you actually claim? So for each claim period, you can claim up to a maximum of $75,000 per business location, or $300,000 in total for all locations. And that includes the amounts claimed by affiliated entities. So as previously mentioned, if one of the affiliated entities is claiming $50,000, you can only have $250,000 remaining for your remaining locations. In general, the criteria on eligible expenses is that the amounts paid or payable to an arm's length party can be included only. Expenses must be paid in respect of a claim period. They must be paid or payable under a written agreement in place before October 9th, 2020. Or if your agreement renewed, that renewal must be under similar terms. So you can't substantially change the agreement and still qualify. As well, if you have not paid the amounts due yet, you must confirm that they will be paid within 60 days of receiving your rent subsidy. So essentially, that's just ensuring that you don't have any cash flow issues. So if you haven't currently paid the amount, once you receive the subsidy, you're confirming that you will pay your landlord their rent amount. You will pay any other amounts. So what are the eligible expenses? So if you rent property, it's obviously going to be your rent, your base rent amount. This could be based on a percentage of sales, profits, or just whatever's in your lease agreement. It could be amounts required to be paid or payable under a net lease agreement. So that's typically your base rent, regular payments for operating expenses, property insurance, utilities, common area maintenance, perhaps property and similar taxes. It will not include sales tax, which would be GST or PST, damages, interest, or penalties, or other special amounts. So for instance, if you're paying tenant insurance or you have to pay for leasehold improvements, that does not qualify as an eligible rent expense. If you are the owner of a property, you can claim property and similar taxes, which would include school and municipal taxes if these are paid as part of your property tax assessment notice, property insurance, as well as any interest on commercial mortgages for the purpose of purchasing that real property. Now, with the commercial mortgage, the mortgage amount cannot exceed the lesser of the lowest total principal amount secured by one of the properties or the actual cost base of the property when first acquired. So what that means is if you bought the property for $500,000, but you end up remortgaging it at some point and now the property has a mortgage of $550,000, that mortgage amount cannot exceed the mortgage cost. It will also not include payments made between non-arm's length or related entities. So what periods can you apply for? Currently, you can apply for September 27th to October 24th, October 25th to November 21st, and as of December 20th, November 22nd to December 19th. So these periods are going to align with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program, and they're going to align with claim periods 8, 9, and 10. So the deadline for application is 180 days after the end of a claim period. So here's a summary. So it lists claim periods 1 to 9. You will notice that claim periods 4 to 9, the periods could be slightly different. They haven't been formally finalized yet, but what you will notice is that they open for application the day after the claim period ends. So for instance, claim period 6 is scheduled to open March 14th after the March 13th closure. So how exactly do you calculate a revenue drop? So there's two methods. So method number one, which looks at the 2019 or the alternative method. So with method number one, you compare the month of 2019 and 2020 that relate to that claim period. Method number two, the alternative method, you look at the average of January and February 2020 revenue and compare it to the months of 2020 that relate to the claim period. So essentially, if in 2019 you had very low revenue, whether that's because you hadn't actually started your business or perhaps you weren't operating at full capacity, you probably want to look at that alternative method because you'll see a larger decrease in your revenue. You do have to use the same option for all future CERS claims. And if you have claimed CEWS, you must use the same method used for periods 5 or later. So they really want to make sure that you're using a consistent method and that you're not swapping every single claim period. So how do you exactly calculate your subsidy rate? So the CRA does have a really good calculator for CERS, but essentially what it is if you have a revenue drop of 70% or more, the maximum subsidy rate you can claim is 65%. If your revenue drops from 50 to 70%, you do have to do a little bit more math. So you take your revenue drop minus 50%, times it by 1.25 plus 40%. So for example, let's say you have a 60% revenue drop. You will end up with about a 53% subsidy. If you have a revenue drop of less than 50%, you essentially take your revenue drop and times it by 0.8. So let's say you have a 10% revenue drop, you end up with an 8% subsidy at the end of the day. There is also something available called top-up or lockdown support. And so what that is that's 25% times the number of days the location was locked down divided by 28, which is the days in a CERS period. And that'll equal your top-up rate. So that lockdown support, it's calculated on a location by location basis. And in order to qualify, first, you must have had a base rent subsidy of greater than 0%. So if your revenue hasn't dropped, you're not getting the top-up. And second, one or more locations had to have been temporarily closed or had activities significantly restricted for a week or longer due to COVID-19 related public health order. So essentially a public health order must have been issued by your federal, provincial, or municipal government or a local health authority. As well, it was having to require you to stop some or all of your regular activities while the order was in place. And those activities that you were not able to carry out must have accounted for at least approximately 25% of your total revenues at that location during the prior reference period. So essentially this is looking at restaurants, for instance, who would have seen dine-in services be curtailed, but they were still allowed to do delivery and pickup orders. So they obviously were probably seeing a drop of revenue, and their dine-in services probably accounted for more than 25% of their typical revenue. So they would be able to qualify for this top-up. Now note that an order that restricts or reduces activities but doesn't require you to close or stop certain activities would not qualify for lockdown support. So that would be areas where you might have had just restricted or reduced hours. You might have had to reduce the number of people that were able to come into the business. Perhaps travel restrictions were in place, which reduced the number of clients. Any of those would not qualify for top-up or lockdown support. As well, you won't qualify for lockdown support if you're already restricted or closed because you failed to comply with a previous public health order. So here is a sample calculation. So in this scenario, we're going to have revenue of approximately $154,000 in 2019. In 2020 September, we're going to have about $154,000 again. October 2019, we're going to have $177,000. And then in October 2020, we're going to drop down to $163,000. So you can see that you have a current period revenue drop, so that would be October to October, of 8.03%. Our previous period revenue drop, so September to September, is actually a negative 0.02% because we actually had a little increase. So we work on whatever the higher number is. So the higher of these revenue drops is 8.03. And because that's below our 50%, we take that times 0.8 and we end up with a rent subsidy of 6.42%. So when you go onto that CRA calculator, you can see that you have, are you doing it as a rental or property? So in this case, we're going to calculate it as a rental. So you just enter the amount of eligible expenses, so the rent for September 2020. So in this case, $5,500. If you had rental income, so if you were subleasing it, you also have to enter that because that is going to be taken off of your expenses because essentially you're receiving some money for the costs being incurred. And then we also do our monthly eligible expenses for October. So again, $5,500. And then you can see that it gives you a little printout. So it tells you all the line items that you're going to eventually have to enter and what number that you're going to be entering. And then it also tells you how much you can expect to receive. So in this case, $322.39. So just there at the bottom of the page. So how do you go about applying? So you can go onto your My Business account, represent a client, and you want to create a CERS or a ZA number. So when you log onto your My Business account, you're going to see that other services box right at the very bottom. And it's going to say, hey, you want to create a Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy number? And you're going to say, sure. You're going to click that. You're going to receive a number, at which point then you can complete an application. So if you've done the calculator on the CRA website, you'll just basically fill in the information, the fields that are required of you. You do want to set yourself up for direct deposit just so you get those funds quicker. And at the very end, you'll just basically attest that you are confirming that the information is accurate. So this was obviously a lot of information, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact us. You can contact me directly at 403-905-2181 or email jkoch@gmhca.com. You can also call the office 403-527-4451, and any partner or associate will be happy to help you. And definitely, if you do have any questions or any kind of specific scenarios that you want to work through, don't hesitate to call. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Chamber of Commerce for letting us kind of provide this information to you in partnership with them. Have a great day.